So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Rohit Bhargava, who is the author of the Non-Obvious series of books, but also a founder of a company by the same name. Hi, Rohit. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
So, Rohit, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a little bit about you and also about the work that you do?
Sure. I spend a lot of my time now thinking about the future and about trends specifically. And so a big part of my work is to produce an annual trend report, which features 15 ideas of trends that will be changing business in the coming year. And so I do this every year. And in December, the 15 trends come out, and I've been publishing a report for the past 7 years.
Perfect.
And I do what I sometimes jokingly call the dumbest thing that an author can do, which is I rewrite about 35% of my book every year, which is not the smartest way to do it, maybe, if I wanted to save a lot of time. But it certainly does make the trends more relevant and I think current as well.
Excellent. Now, I wanted to organize this interview because, in line with the Trends Report, you've published the new book, which sort of expands on that and reflects on some of the previous trends. But the new book is called Non-Obvious, the 2017 edition, How to Think Different, Curate Ideas and Predict the Future. Now, you've told me a little bit about sort of the report, but tell me a bit about the book and sort of its central thesis, like sort of who's it for, what's its purpose, that sort of stuff.
The book was born out of, I think, some level of frustration on my part. And the frustration was that every year I would read these predictions. Everybody loves predictions, and there's tons of them out there. And they would talk about things that I just thought were obvious. They would say things like, mobile devices are gaining in adoption, and that was a trend, a so-called trend.
Right.
And I just thought, well, duh, right?
Yeah.
I mean, how is that a trend? And the frustration of that led me towards producing my first report back in 2011. And the idea was, let me describe what's happening in the world of marketing and social media, which was the world that I came from. I spent over 10 years working in large agencies. I'm a branding and marketing guy. And so that was the world that I was coming from. And so the first 2 years that I did the report, it was specifically for marketing people. And It was, what are the trends changing marketing? After the first 2 years, I decided to broaden the focus. And so then I started talking about things like technology and design, customer care and consumer culture, economics, entrepreneurship, media and entertainment. And now, since sort of the third year of the report until now, I now have it in 5 different categories. So there's 3 trends in each category, and marketing and social media are just one of those 5 categories.
Okay. Now, I mean, one of the things that because you mentioned customer care there, and that's an area that I'm interested in, like all things sort of service, experience, engagement. And the book, I mean, I've got a copy of the book and I've gone through it and I kind of like plowed through it kind of voraciously. And I was like, oh yeah, of course. Yes, of course. And then, oh yeah, I'm sort of thinking the same thing, which is great. But rather than actually just going through the whole book, I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about a few of those trends that I think are relevant for my audience and what we can learn from them.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
And if possible, there's one trend. Let's start with the one trend which you've termed sort of passive loyalty. So I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about that and what we should be looking out for.
Passive loyalty was a way of describing this myth that I think we believe in business, which is that we either have loyal customers or we don't.
Right.
And loyalty is not all one shade. There's lots of gray areas. And one of the things I really started uncovering was this sense that a loyal customer, or someone you think is a loyal customer, is just one great offer away from leaving.
Right.
And that's a really scary thing if you think about it from a business point of view.
Yeah.
And so the trend was describing the sense of, well, why are people passively loyal? And what's the difference between someone who's passively loyal and someone who just buys something from you once?
Right.
Because I think the normal definition of loyalty is, they continue to buy from me, right? They're a subscriber. They come back over and over again.
Sure.
And the problem is that a lot of times people do that out of habit. They do it out of convenience. They do it out of price. But those aren't the traditionally wise metrics to use when it comes to whether someone's loyal or not, right? Because if they get a better price, they leave.
Yes.
If they find a store that happens to be closer to their job than you are and you're no longer on the way, they leave. And so the question that this trend raises is, well, how do we create true loyalty? How do we create loyalty where people love the brand or love the experience in such a way that not only do they avoid other things when those other things come along, but they become those active advocates and those types of customers that every brand wants.
Right. Okay. And so what are you asking kind of firms to do about that? Is it almost just like you flagging up this trend there to create awareness, or is there that you think that they should do some things specifically?
Yeah, this was one of the first things that I thought about when I started doing these trend reports, which is, was I going to do it in the way that most trend work is done through futurists, which is, hey, this is what's happening, and if you want to know what to do with it, then you hire me for expensive consulting and I tell you what to do, right? Because that's the traditional way to do it.
Sure.
And instead of doing that, I decided, well, if I was going to truly write a useful book, then it's not enough to just identify the trend. I actually have to tell people what to do about it.
Right.
And so with each one of the trends, at the end of the discussion of the trend and why it's a trend and why it matters, there's 3 tips for what to do about the trend.
Okay.
So how to use the trend and what you need to think about doing. And so for passive loyalty, one of the tips that I share with people is you can't start to move your customers from being passively loyal to actively loyal if you don't know which customers are passively loyal and which ones are actively loyal.
Right.
And so the first tip there is you have to get smarter about segmenting those customers, because a lot of times we don't even know.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the first step. Now that may seem, pretty straightforward, but in doing that, it's actually quite complex if you think about it, because it's a gray line. And so you really have to think about, depending on what business you're in and what industry you're in, how would you actually identify someone who is not truly loyal versus someone who's kind of sort of loyal.
Yeah, and I guess it also becomes more complicated as you get into if we start looking at demographics, and actually those demographic categories or segments may not actually kind of hold as we just if you start taking into account different consumer behaviors and preferences, and so the emergence of different sort of ethnographic kind of groups. So it's actually all that sort of stuff is becoming kind of getting a little bit more kind of blurred these days, and therefore it's not as simple as you suggest in terms of just pure traditional segmentation.
Yeah, the other thing that makes it tough is one of the other companies that I own is a publishing company, and if you think about the nature of that, publishers sell books through a lot of other distribution points, retailers, third parties, where they don't get that sort of data.
Yeah.
And so, you think about that situation where you're not necessarily the retailer, you're selling through someone else.
Yeah.
How do you now start to uncover this when you don't have that direct connection to the consumer?
Sure. Ooh, big challenges ahead.
There are, yeah, sure.
So let's move on. Let's touch on a couple more of these trends. Now, the one that that then kind of stood out for me was this one called invisible sort of technology. Can you tell us a little bit more about that one?
Invisible technology is fascinating, the research behind this, and the process that I use is a very visual, spread out kind of process. And so actually the first part of the book, the first several chapters, I actually talk about the process that I use for identifying trends. And the reason I talk about the process is because I think that it's something that any of us can learn how to start doing and using in our own professional lives. And so one of my big philosophies is anyone can learn how to predict the future. It's not just the domain of these small group of highly trained futurists. I believe that we can all teach ourselves how to do that. And the first step there is being more observant. And so invisible technology, as I started observing stories and things that were coming out, I started uncovering this idea that the technology that is around us increasingly is trying to blend itself into the backdrop. And so you have some examples like Amazon's Echo and some of these voice-activated zero UI, as it's being called in the design world, types of products where there's no user interface. You just talk to it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of one level of this. But the other level is these things that we don't generally hear about. I mean, there was a really interesting story of a new technology that fixes these very, very small cracks that happen in airplane wings due to the normal stress of flying, which was kind of terrifying to find out about, to be honest. But as I was reading about it, it's this material that's made out of this powder, and they use it to fill the airplane wings and the cracks, these micro cracks. And it's just this microscopic powder that when the crack forms, it turns itself into a liquid, and then it hardens and it fixes the airplane wing. And it allows for what I talked about in the book and what they call a self-healing airplane wing.
Right.
Which is such a cool idea. I mean, if you think about that, or if you think about what they call thirsty concrete, which is this like material that soaks up water and you can make roads out of it. And so now when you have flash floods, the actual pavement can soak up some water to help avoid some of these flash floods that happen on roads. And so these are technology that is baked into the things that are around us. That these are not technology that's kind of going down the road that we see or that we have to interface with swipes. This is stuff that's invisible.
Yeah. It's like it just becomes like the fabric of life in many ways.
Right, and more of technology is heading in that direction. And so this trend was meant to describe that idea.
Okay. I mean, that's really, really interesting. But then I guess the non-visible side of things is, in terms of technology side of things, is it kind of starts to emerge in another trend that you start to mention, which you talk about the robot renaissance. I mean, tell me a bit more about that, but also this idea around kind of renaissance.
The term renaissance was one that was very intentionally chosen. And I think you'll see, or what anyone will see as they read through these trends, is I spend a lot of time thinking about the name of the trend and how I'll use that name to describe it. I mean, I am a branding guy, so I spend a lot of time branding the trend. And the term Renaissance felt like the right one for me because a Renaissance in history is sort of a moment of awakening.
Right.
And that's, I think, what's happening with robots right now, because we've had robots for many years.
Right.
But usually when you thought about robots, you thought about them in the manufacturing context or in the context of factories. And now what you have is this emergence of more and more robots that are meant to be social, that are meant to interact with humans. You have robot play toys that read kids' stories. You have a robot butler that's being tested in several hotels that will deliver you your toothbrush if you forgot one. You call down to the front desk and they'll send the robot up to deliver it. And so all these fascinating uses for robots, and the fact that one of the hugest challenges when it comes to robot adoption isn't the technology at all. It's what do we do with people? I mean, you think about that robot in the hotels, and if you called down to the front desk and said, I need a toothbrush, and they would send the robot up, and the robot goes from the front desk and gets into the elevator, and there's a person in the elevator, what happens then?
Yeah.
Right? Because that's pretty terrifying to be in an elevator and a robot just randomly comes in. It doesn't press any buttons. It just knows where to go.
Yeah.
And so the interaction between people was the biggest challenge that they had to figure out, which is how does that robot interact with the person who's in the elevator so that person doesn't freak out?
Yeah, does a robot look you in the eye and then nod its head and go, what's up?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because it's funny because culturally this is a very American thing, which is when someone else gets into the elevator with you, you must acknowledge them in some way. It's not acceptable socially to not accept them and to not to acknowledge them. And that's not the same in every culture. I mean, in other cultures, people are fine being in an elevator without acknowledging one another at all. But that's a very un-American thing.
Yeah.
And so when they tested it in America, like that was a cultural nuance that they had to somehow deal with.
Right. And then the final trend I wanted to ask you about, it was this idea of the sort of the mainstream mindfulness. If you describe for us a little bit more about what's happening and why we should be paying attention to it, because there's also another thing I wanted to ask you around kind of mindfulness. But if you tell us a bit more about the trend first, that'd be great.
Yeah, mainstream mindfulness was the describing this idea that more and more in the business environment, leaders and human resources professionals as well are understanding the relationship between being more mindful and getting more productivity and happiness at work. Mm-hmm. And so you have things like meditation classes happening in work. You have leaders who are taking these sorts of courses and things that at one point, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, just seemed kind of odd or fringe. Mm-hmm. And now it's becoming mainstream. And so that's the mainstreaming part of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have a lot of high-profile examples of companies. You think about LinkedIn or Google or any of these larger companies that have these individuals who are in charge of mindfulness, and that's a job now within these companies. And I think that that's a pretty big thing. It's a pretty big deal. And so this trend is meant to describe that and the role that has in everything from employee engagement to productivity, to all of these things that really make a huge difference when you think about the inner workings of a company.
And what do you think of this is in response to in terms of the mindfulness?
I think that the popularity of it is probably in response to some high-profile examples. I mean, there's lots and lots of celebrities who swear by meditation now. Yeah. There's lots of business gurus who say their ability to be mindful or have meditation has dramatically improved what they're able to do. So I think that a big part of the mainstreaming of it has really come from high-profile examples of people who say, this isn't just crazy stuff, this actually works.
Yeah. So, because when I think about mindfulness, a lot of it it feels to me a bit like it's a bit like sort of being more aware of the things we do and why we do them. So it's all a bit like awareness of paying more attention, and therefore by doing that, then we can take more deliberate action, I guess.
Yes. I don't mean to conflate meditation with mindfulness, because you're right. Meditation is just one piece of it.
Yeah.
And mindfulness is very much this idea of doing things consciously and being aware of your surroundings and being more attuned to all of those things. And meditation is kind of a technique that can help you get there. Mm.
So the question I had around it, because I find the mindfulness thing really, really interesting, because I also think, well, if there's a trend towards individuals becoming kind of more mindful in in their lives, in their work, etc. But I also think about people in an organizational kind of context and organizations are made up of people. Is there also this extension where actually that organizationally we need to become more mindful as well? Because I've seen examples where you get many companies or organizations, and they come across a problem, and as soon as they become aware of a problem, then they jump into sort of fix or solve mode, and that's not particularly kind of mindful. That's just very much a kind of habit-driven sort of response. And so I just wondered kind of what your thoughts are on this idea about sort of how do organizations become more mindful as a collective?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think that the way that organizations, at least the ones that I'm studying, are starting to inject more mindfulness on an organizational level are through encouraging certain disciplines or practices that I think lead to more mindful thinking. So, for example, mandated free thinking time.
Right.
Where you say that a certain percentage of every employee's time has to be spent just coming up with new stuff, as opposed to getting into what you described just now as the fix mode.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one way. Another really great practice that I've seen some companies do is instituting a 5-minute silence at the beginning of beginning of meetings.
Right.
And the idea behind that is it gives you a chance to reset and to start breathing and to kind of go through all the normal mental processes of what am I going to have for dinner tonight? Wonder what time the kids are coming home. Did I lock the door this morning? You got to get through all of that mental stuff, and then your mind just kind of clears. And eventually, through those 5 minutes, your mind gets back to, wait, why was I here? What was this meeting about? Oh yeah, that's what it's about. Let me start thinking about that. And us in our minds, it's easy to, when you describe it like that, it's easy to see the value of taking that time out to be mindful instead of just bringing all that baggage into every meeting that we walk into and therefore not being able to be totally present.
Yeah. As an aside, as you were talking about that 5-minute example there, it reminded me of a book by Aldous Huxley. It was the last book that he wrote, and it was called Island. And it's his, if you like, version of Utopia in many ways. And it was based on this island community that is, and at its heart, the people on the island have, their whole culture is based on Mahayana Buddhism. And funnily enough, across the island, there's all these minor birds that are trained to say throughout the day repeatedly, "Be here now, be here now," and it just your example of that 5 minutes at the beginning of a meeting just reminded me of that book, which I hadn't read in a long time. So,
it's interesting.
Thank you for that.
No, thank you. I'll have to check that book out.
So, given that we're kind of, I'm really interested in the whole service and experience and engagement sort of space from a customer and employee sort of perspective. I mean, are there any other sort of particular trends from the book that or from your report this year that you think are relevant, that you think you'd like to point us to, that you think actually that's another one that we should be paying attention to?
There was one around this idea of the growing role of women in something called fierce femininity that's been really popular when I've been talking about it. And I think the reason why it's been so popular for people is because it feels like it's describing something that's just now really kind of taking on a little bit of a different life.
Right.
And the way I described it was very, very intentional, again, in what I called it. And I called it fierce femininity because I think when you traditionally think about femininity, fierce is not a word that you would associate with it.
Yeah.
And when you put those two together, I think you're describing something that's a little bit different, that doesn't necessarily only describe women, because I think that men and women both have feminine and masculine qualities.
Sure.
That can kind of move up or move down based on your personality. And what this describes is this new kind of power coming from the feminine side of thinking, which is leading people to success, whether they are female or male. But it's obviously more in leading more females towards finding this type of success in becoming leaders and in taking the old perceptions and changing them. And so this sense that they're the princess in the tower waiting to be rescued isn't really the story that we tell now.
Right.
The story we tell is of the Hunger Games, Rogue One, girl kicks ass and saves everybody.
Yeah.
That's the story that we're seeing now.
Excellent. So Rohit, if somebody's listening to this or reading the highlights and they say, that all sounds interesting, I can see signs of all of this and I like what I'm hearing and I want to start employing some of these trends and insights into my firm, I mean, where would you encourage them to start? I mean, what sort of things should be doing first? I mean, obviously apart from buying your book.
Yes, buying the book is a great first start. You should definitely do that, yes. But beyond buying the book, I would say that there's a couple things. One is I have a team that runs workshops specifically around this to help companies figure out what do we do with these trends, what are the ones that are most relevant for us, and also how do we think in this way to identify our own trends, because the 15 that I write about aren't obviously the only trends.
Yes.
So this way of thinking can lead you towards seeing things that your competitors don't, and therefore kind of finding that green space and being ready for it. So that's the kind of more involved angle, which says, come in and sort of do something like that. But I do think that one of the things that people are very much able to do is do that sort of thinking in their own groups. And so I have an entire guide that I talk about in the book for how to take some of these things and run a workshop around them for yourself or for your own team. And it's very step-by-step, and it kind of takes the methodology that we use but breaks it down into such a way that you could do that internally with your own team.
Right.
And so that would be a place for people to start as well. That wouldn't require you to go out and it sort of does require you to buy the book, but that's a lot cheaper than a workshop. So
yeah. Okay, perfect. So I've got two final kind of questions that I'd like to ask. And the first one is related to a book that I wrote last year called How to Wow, and it was all about sort of service and experience and trying to break down the whole sort of process and drill into all the different sort of elements and case study all sorts of different kind of ideas and tactics that have worked for other people in other areas. But what I have been doing is asking everybody that I've been speaking to on the podcast is to ask them just to share their perspective about what wow service or wow experience kind of means for them. So if you could share some ideas on that, that would be excellent.
I think that doing things that are sort of secret surprises and things like that are a great way to deliver that wow. And I love the title, by the way.
Thank you.
Of the book. But to me, the everyday wow is when you teach people in customer service to be proactively honest in ways that they don't have to be.
Right.
Because I think that the number one way to have that wow is to have trust with the customer. And the way that you earn trust is by giving that customer that level of expertise and detail that they didn't necessarily ask for, but that's valuable for them to know. And putting yourself into their mindset. And so that proactive honesty, which is not somebody asked you directly and you give them an answer. This is volunteering that information because you have an expert and you have their best experience in mind that you're trying to deliver. That's really powerful.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And that brings me to my last question that I always ask at the end of these interviews. And the question is this. So, Rohit, is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Shamelessly plug. Well, I suppose since we're talking about a book, I should probably start by saying that this book is available online and definitely pick it up. So that would be one. And I think the other thing that I would love to plug is one of the things that it says on my business card, which is the last way that I describe myself on my business card beyond being a marketer and storyteller and all of that is a nice guy.
Right.
And the reason why I put that on there is because I love when people contact me when this raises an idea for them and they want to learn more about it or they want to interact. And so the last thing I guess I would plug is get in touch, contact me, because I don't have armies of people that filter through every email and make sure that nothing reaches me. Things reach me directly. And so I would love to hear from anyone who found this interesting and wants to learn more. So that's what I'd plug.
Fantastic. And how would people get in touch with you directly, Rohit?
You can go straight through my website, which is just my name, rohitbhargava.com. Or I'm happy to give you my email address, and you can put that in the show notes, and people can use that as well.
Perfect. That's brilliant. So Rohit, I'll make sure I get all that edited up and linked up and written up. Give you a big shout out, particularly the book, and push people to or encourage people to reach out to you. But I just want to say that's been excellent and fascinating, and congratulations on the work that you do, and thank you for your time today. That's been excellent.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it as well.